Thank you, Adarsh, and thanks, of course, to the Emerging Markets Association for arranging this whole series. What I will do here is take about half an hour, share with you my perspective on China's economic slowdown, and then hopefully we'll have some time to engage in a dialogue, some Q&A, and so on. And essentially, the fact that China's economy is slowing down, I don't think that's going to be of news to anybody in the room. But what I do here is, look at the data so that we understand in a reasonably comprehensive manner why the slowdown and whether the slowdown is temporary or permanent, meaning structural, whether managing the slowdown will be easy or difficult, what kind of reforms are needed to manage the slowdown, and what implications does it have for companies as they are looking for market opportunities, right? So that's my goal here. I think it's, if you look at China, this is a picture of Pudong, roughly about, I would say, early 1990s, right? And so I think it's quite accurate to say, in my view, that China is, deserves to be, particularly over the last 20 to 30 years, deserves to be called almost like the eighth wonder of the world in terms of the size of the economy and the growth rate of the economy over the last 30 years. And so we all know, of course, in fact, how the picture of Pudong changed in about 15 to 20 years. So that's a picture of how China has come from there to here. The question now is, how does it go from here on? Now that's the picture of Pudong, but of course, more often than not, the picture of Pudong actually looks like this. And so the starting point for China of tomorrow is not the starting point that existed in 1995. And that's only, this of course, is not just what we see in Shanghai, but this is a picture that we see in virtually every big city in China, beginning to see even in medium-sized cities in China. And it's probably accurate to say that if we, at least from my conversations, that if we ask most Chinese, forget about the rich, but even middle-income people, what is the single most issue, single most concern that they have on their minds, pollution is probably going to be right up there as either number one or one of the top two. So this is now a serious issue which has implications of all types, including for the type of economic growth that China can pursue or needs to pursue. But that's only one, and of course, why this pollution, air pollution in particular that these pictures represent, is because about 70% of China's energy comes from coal. As you can see from this picture, in terms of the worldwide coal demand, China actually, it's only about 12% of the world's GDP, but it's 50% of the world's coal consumption. And so that's one of the issues that we will build on. Another issue that we will build on is really what's happening in terms of demographics. So if we go back to the 1980s, a bulk of the Chinese population would actually have been pictures like this. And essentially, that's the growth of China's labor force at the pace of about 1% a year. Now, in fact, increasingly, certainly the labor force is no longer growing, but increasingly the demographics of the population are going to start to look like this. So once again, demographically, what China was in the 80s or early 90s, it's a very different China today, and ultimately the future is built on today. And so therefore that has implications for China's growth. Now if I build on that, and now we look at numbers, this is what the picture looks like. Clearly there have been kind of fluctuations in the growth rate, but basically what we can say that from 2000 to 2010, 2011, the average growth rate was about 10 to 11%, more like 10.4% to be exact. Now if you look at the recent years, 2011, 10, 11, 12, and the projections, as best as official projections exist right now, there is a clear trend towards a slowdown, and nobody, certainly nobody in the Chinese government is saying that this trend is somehow a temporary and that it will go back up from 7.5 towards a 9 or a 10. Right? And so there is widespread belief in China, outside China, in official circles, as well as, let's say, the private sector, that the slowdown is structural, that the slowdown is permanent. So how do we kind of decode that, make sense of it? So when I look at, of course, the breakdown of the GDP, and GDP can be looked at from the input side in terms of the supply side, the factors that go into creating value, or it can be looked at from the demand side. Both are equally relevant, and ultimately the two sides must balance, they must equal. But in terms of the subject matter that I'm focusing on here, the supply side analysis is easier to get a handle on. So I focus on the supply side, and according to most analysis of China's GDP growth, I just picked the last 10, 12 years, that this is how the breakdown will be. That of the 10.4% growth rate averaged out in China's GDP, okay, essentially GDP is what? It's value added. It's the sigma of value added by all activities in the economy. And so what creates the value? It's people. Of course, you give people capital, and you give people knowledge, technology, and often capital and technology are intertwined. And so that leads to creation of greater value. It's like a farmer working with his bare hands versus a farmer that you give a tractor, for example, right? And so if you look at from the supply side, the 10.4% breaks down roughly about 5%. Okay, so let me take the 1%, roughly about 1% annual growth in GDP is because 1% annual growth in the labor pool in China. Number two is that labor pool has been backed up with more capital available to it, and more capital available to it, about 5% of the annual growth in GDP is coming from capital investment, growth in capital investment. The other about 4.5% is coming from annual growth in total factor productivity, which means the productivity of labor and capital, right? So essentially, if we look at this, it's clear, and these are just the numbers to back up what the media have been saying, left, right, and center, is that China's economy has been very much an investment-driven, investment-led economy. In fact, the impact of investment has been even greater, let's say, on the demand side, the impact of exports, and so on. So primarily, I look at China as an investment-driven economy, and you can see that gross fixed capital formation percentage of GDP has risen dramatically. And right now, in fact, 2011 to 2012, the numbers tell us that it's not currently kind of slowing down in any significant manner. So the question now is, if you look at these factors or these components that are contributing to GDP growth, what should we expect in the coming 5 years, 10 years, and beyond? So I take here investment, and bulk of the investment goes in what? It goes in infrastructure, it goes in real estate, and it goes in factories. Right? That's bulk of it. So I look at all of these components one by one. And then, of course, I also look at the other factor, which is labor pool, and then we can talk about total factor productivity. So if you look at infrastructure, right? And so infrastructure and real estate, all of that, I look at urbanization, right? And in fact, Prime Minister Li Keqiang has talked about urbanization as one of the major planks of China's economic growth, and I completely agree with that part. A question I would still ask in terms of looking ahead is that China's urbanization, by government figures, right now is smack at about 50%. So it started at 20 in 1980, and in fact, all projections are the State Council in China, you look at other countries and so on, that when they become developed economies, basically urbanization peaks out at about 75 to 80%. Right? Now, urbanization doesn't go in kind of one straight line. It doesn't even go like that. It follows an S-curve. And so we are smack in the middle of that S-curve. Essentially what it means is that over the next 5 years, the shift from rural to urban, because now we're in the second half of the S-curve, or the S-curve, beyond the inflection point, that just a shift from rural to urban, every reason to believe that in the next 5 years it will be somewhat less. Yes, there will be more urbanization, but the pace of urbanization will be somewhat slower than in the last 5 years. That's number one. Number two is that Pudong, Beijing, Tianjin, Guangzhou, they're all, in fact, Jiangsu, most Suzhou, etc., they're all, Nanjing, they're all highly developed, right? So the new urbanization that is going to take place will be in the tier 3, tier 4, tier 5 cities. Essentially think about the buildings, that those will be lower capex buildings. And so therefore the urbanization, even that 1% shift from rural to urban in a tier 3 city means lower investment as compared to in a tier 1 city. Right? So that's number one. Essentially, my point being is that the pace of investment behind urbanization next 5 years has to be slower than in the last 5 years, the pace of growth. And of course, what's happened now is that because of so much, this is Ordos, Inner Mongolia, right? Essentially, what's talked about is largely a ghost town. That the urbanization in many parts of China has gotten ahead of demand. Okay, so that's another factor that's just feeds into yes, continuing urbanization, but slower. Look at other aspects of infrastructure, which of course include whether it's highways, airports, rail, or ports and the like, etc. I just pick one of them as an indicator. So if you look at domestic air traffic in China, which clearly drives the demand for airports, right? Clear, yes, absolutely. More air travel in China as people have more money, for sure. However, if you look at the growth rate of domestic air traffic in China, what's the trend? It slows down, right? And so once again, more in absolute numbers, but a slower growth. New airports are being built, they are going to be built, but they're not going to be like the Beijing Capital International Airport, right? And so once again, it has implications for the amount of capital. Look at cars, and I just picked one sector in the economy which drives factories. Of course, factories to make cars, factories to make auto components, factories to make tire, factories to make steel. And so in most economies, including the US, or Germany, or Japan, and China, the auto industry is the absolute prime mover in the economy with a lot of multiplier effects. So it's useful to look at the auto sector, what's happening there. And we know that the auto industry in China is now actually the largest in the world. So here are numbers for passenger vehicles. So I took out commercial vehicles, but the argument remains absolutely the same. Is US commercial passenger vehicles this year will be about 10 to 11 million cars. China already is at 15 million cars, right? And so if you look at the growth rate, absolutely and massively robust. Right? About 37% compounded annual per year. That's huge, right? Going from 0.6 million to about 15 million. But now think about the number of cars on Beijing's roads in 2000 and the number of cars on Beijing's roads in 2013. Can the growth rate continue? Absolutely not. Not only is it physically impossible, the municipal corporation in Beijing has already said this is not going to happen because the city cannot take it physically, either in terms of traffic patterns or in terms of pollution, right? Also, if you look at the population density in China, and I'm not talking about the whole of China, which is irrelevant because you can essentially take out Xinjiang, Tibet, and so on, but if you look at the central and eastern China, where bulk of the Chinese population lives, and you look at the population density there, there is no way that China can have, even when it is as rich as the US, that China can have the same level of auto penetration in terms of percentage of the families or individuals owning cars as people in the US, right? Because auto penetration in Europe is less than in the US. In Japan, it's less than in the US, and it's driven, of course, by population density, right? And so essentially, and so when I look at China, and I say, okay, you know, in the US, the auto penetration is about 80%. Okay, so I'm saying, okay, so what should we assume for China? I'm not going to assume 80%. We look at Europe, we look at Japan, and so on. A number that I come up with is about 50 to 60%. Okay, and so 50 to 60%, that's kind of the peak. Meaning, after that, the auto market in China would be regarded as mature. Now, whether that happens in 10 years or 20 years or 50 years, I don't look at that right now. 1.3 million, 3 billion people, what that means is at peak, the number of cars on the roads in China is not likely to be more than about 600 to 650 million cars, right? Now, if you have 600 to 650 million cars, and the average life of a car is about 12 years, 10 to 12 years. What that means is that China's auto market at peak will be about 50 to 60 million cars, right? It cannot be 8. It's impossible, unless the Beijing government decides, you know, to permit 3 million more cars on the roads, which is not going to happen. And so if China's auto market peaks out at 50 to 60 million cars, it's already at 15, and that peaking isn't going to happen in the next 5 years, right? In fact, if you're at 15 and you grow the car market at 5% a year, it becomes 60 million in 20 years. By 2030, will China's car market have peaked? Probably not, which means that even a 5% annual growth in the auto market in China over the next 20 years is probably optimistic. So essentially and you can already look at what's happening 2010 to 11, 11 to 12, and so on. So kind of my own projection is that I cannot imagine how China's car market grows at more than 5 to 6% a year as compared to what it did over the last 10 years. And that has huge implications for capex in auto plants and all the things that feed into the car market. Okay? And of course, this is one of the biggest industries in any economy, including in China. So here we are talking about investment in factories, investment in housing, investment in infrastructure, and so on. Some other things, of course, you know, the demand side, if you look at exports, what has happened, that China's share of world merchandise exports has gone from about 4% to about 10.5% to 11%, right? And that's because world exports grew at 10, China's exports grew at 20. Okay? Now, if China's exports continue to grow at the same pace relative to world exports, by 2025, China's share of world merchandise exports will be 25%. Okay, imagine the brouhaha in the world when China's export share went from 4 to 10. That's a 6% eating up. Market share is always 100%. But if it goes from 10 to 25, that's eating up 15%. That can only happen if the big economies that are the importers, Europe, US, India, they decide to commit economic suicide. It's unlikely that they would. What that means is completely taking aside the question of is China going to be more or less competitive on the export market, even if it remains as competitive as it has been, but there are some questions about that. On the demand side, there is no way that that growth will be permitted, if you will, by the buyers, by the potential importers to continue, right? And so therefore, export growth has to slow down. Demographics, we all know. Labor pool in China, it grew at about 1% a year. Already it has peaked out, and it will pretty soon, in a couple of years, start to actually decline at about 0.5% a year. So in labor force, instead of being at plus 1% into GDP, will be a minus 0.5% into GDP, right? So if you take all of these, and it's not clear what any politician, no matter how smart he or she is, can do anything about it, right? And so therefore, I would conclude that the slowdown in China's economy is absolutely and totally inevitable. It's totally structural. And the only thing that smart politicians can do, that smart leaders can do, is to manage the transition effectively, right? Without too much trauma. But can they reverse the transition? No. Can they reverse the slowdown? No. I mean, essentially, right? I mean, it's like trees don't grow to the sky. And given the size and development stage of China's economy, there is no way it can continue growing at the pace. The days of 10% double digit are over, but I would say the days of 8% are over. They will just never, ever come back. And, I'll skip this one because the point was made already. So the question now is, okay, reform. And so reform, essentially what we are talking about is shift away from investment-driven growth. Actually, let me pick up on that chart. So if you look at fixed asset investment, which is what I was looking at so far, is that China's fixed asset investment has actually grown. This is in, adjusted for inflation and so on, so this is in real terms, grew at about 14%. If you adjust for inflation, etc., it grew at a faster pace, about 18% and so on. And it grew even faster during this time frame. Now, from here on, let's assume that CapEx continues to grow. So I'm not saying that CapEx in 2014 is going to be less in real terms, net of inflation, than in 2013 or 12. Let's assume it grows. And let's assume that it grows at only 5% a year. Even then, during the next 5 years, it will be about 58% higher than in the last 5 years. So given what I talked about, housing and real estate and the auto sector and so on, etc., on the demand side, the exports, even at 5% growth, and if CapEx grows at 5, that by itself means that contribution of CapEx to GDP growth, instead of being 5% out of 10.4%, is 2%. Right? So we are talking not about a slowdown by 0.5% or 1. We are talking about a significant slowdown. And let me look at one number. And so here is a number that I see as closer to realistic, more realistic, if you will, or the numbers that I would be willing to bet some of my money on, which is that growth in CapEx will be around 5% real terms max over the coming 5 to 10 years. Household consumption, which has grown significantly more slowly as compared to capital investment, that will in fact also slow down. If CapEx slows down, that will slow down too. But it will be faster still than the growth in capital investment. The sum total of that probably will be that China's economy is more likely to grow at 6 rather than at 8 or 7.5 or 10.5, right? So that's the those are the reasons behind the slowdown, and that's the kind of slowdown that I think is going to happen. But this transition is going to be very difficult because yes, China is a command and control economy, but that's only what it appears to be on the surface. In reality, actually, power in China is already highly decentralized. It's decentralized to enterprises, particularly the state-owned enterprises, and the CEOs and party secretaries of the state-owned enterprises are extremely powerful people, and some of them are more powerful than the cabinet ministers, number one. And of course, the power is decentralized to local governments at the province level or at the city level or the county level, right? And so we look at what's in it for them. So, bulk of, who has been, what kind of enterprises have been behind all the capital investment? It's the big banks, It's the big steel companies, it's the big cement companies, of course it's the big auto companies, and all of them are state-owned enterprises, virtually all of them. In fact, 90% of the market share, whether it's in steel or cement or banking or autos, is state-owned enterprises. Right? The auto, of course, you have joint ventures, but the JV partners are the state-owned enterprises. Shanghai Auto, Beijing Auto, and so on. Right? And so, if you have to move away from investment-driven growth to consumption-driven growth, you're not going to need that much more steel or cement or tires and so on. And so therefore, it has significant implications for the power. And will they give up that power easily? That's number one. And of course, the other side is that in China, as in virtually every other emerging economy, including India, you have massive amount of rent seeking by the officials. Okay, and a huge chunk of that rent seeking opportunity comes about in terms of acquiring land, right? Taking land from farmers at a certain price, and of course, who knows what the right price is? And obviously, the farmers disagree on the price that they are being paid for taking over their land and giving that land to developers, right? At significantly higher markups, and then capturing some of that rent. So therefore, there are interests, and again, you can see, and this goes, right from the bottom to the very top, and everybody is kind of, if you will, involved in this. Every person in power, and so that's not going to be easy, right? So essentially, President Xi, Prime Minister Li, they face a huge challenge. They, as best as I can see from the material that comes out of the Chinese government, for example, is that they understand the problem. They also understand what needs to be done, but it's not going to be easy for them because they don't have the kind of power that Deng Xiaoping did or Chairman Mao did. Right? Now, let's assume that the transition gets managed and gets managed well. China will still be a massively big economy 10 years from now. And I just look at, say, household consumption, and let's assume that household consumption, as I said earlier, grows at about 7.5% a year. And so in real terms, against 2.5% at the beginning of the decade, it'll be about double. Or if you adjust for maybe currency appreciation, maybe inflation differences between China and inflation, then it could be that nominal terms in 10 years, China's market, in terms of household consumption, could be 4 times, right? So real terms twice, and maybe in nominal terms about 4 times. So it's still going to be very, very large, right? But essentially what it is that for the size of economy that China has right now, even a 6% growth rate, okay, will mean doubling the economy in about 12 years, right? And doubling the economy in 12 years means that in 12 years, China's economy becomes as large in real terms as the US economy is right now. So that still will be a very powerful accomplishment. With one important strategy point, certainly for the country, for the banks, for multinationals, is that if you expect 6 and you plan for 6, and you make your investments according to 6, you're going to come out fine. But if you plan for 8 or you plan for 10 and the reality is 6, then you're going to be in deep trouble, right? And so that's why it's important not just to anticipate what the slowdown will be, but what the magnitude and pace of that slowdown will be. And it's in that kind of a misalignment that companies can go seriously wrong. In fact, my co-author and I, we wrote about Caterpillar, and how Caterpillar is one of the reasons it's in deep trouble. It's completely and totally miscalculated. Did not even do the back of the envelope analysis about China's economy. So I think that pretty much sums it up. This is my last slide, is that China deserves to be called economically the 8th wonder of the world. But at the same time, given where it is right now, I think we can also say what got you here won't get you there, right? And that it's hard to imagine how over the next 10 years the average growth rate could be higher than 6. But even that, to manage a smooth slowdown, will be a challenge, right? And will be a challenge domestically, and will be, of course, a challenge for countries that are China's economic partners, whether on the export side or the imports side, right? And as I said here, is that if you plan, 6% growth rate, it's still very robust, given the kind of economy China has right now. But the key is, if you plan for 10 and the reality happens to be 6, then you're going to be. So that's my story, and I'll be happy. I think we still have some time to, any questions you may like to pose.
So I got a question about the new leadership in China, because President Xi, the first strategy when he's on board is to deal with the corruption. So there's a concern about that's because he couldn't figure out a strategy for the economy, because the economy is in big trouble, in huge challenge, and the think tank could not think about strategy. And also, which you said, the people are more educated. So in the past years, the people in China just, the government told what they to do, they just do it. Now they can think about it. So they don't trust the government, they don't trust the formal institution, because they are more educated. They now have their own value and things like that. So there's a concern in China, China will be experience a political reform in the next 10 to 20 years. It's either top down or bottom up. So which one do you think is more?
I think that on the economic side, I believe that the leadership, President Xi and Prime Minister Premier Li, I think they are quite clear. And it seems like while there are going to be implementation challenges of the type I talked about, I think they appear to be determined to keep marching ahead towards economic reform. In fact, just to, first if you look at the actions over the last 10 months, or not 10 months, March they officially took charge in the last 6 months or so. But also, in 2012, February, there was a document by the World Bank called China 2030. And it talked about the kind of reform Chinese economy needs over the next 20 years or 18 years. And it was, in a way, shocking to read in that report statements almost like word for word, if I remember correctly. It said, the state-owned enterprises in China are like a stone around China's neck, and their power must be reduced, and major structural reform needs to be instituted starting now. Now, that's very blunt, right? What's particularly interesting is that that report was co-signed by two people, the president of the World Bank and by the head of the Development Research Center of China State Council, which means the China State Council had officially endorsed the viewpoints. Now, when I talk to people in China who are well connected, they told me even last year, this has already been approved by President Xi and Premier Li, and they're just preparing the ground. And so in a way, it's a little bit of a battle between the Standing Committee on the one side and SASAC and NDRC on the other side. That's what I was talking about, the challenge of implementation, but I think the top leadership is very clear on the economic side. On the political side, big challenges. Yes, there is a massive drive against corruption, but the thing is that corruption is not something that's confined to one segment of China. It's not even that it's confined to mid-level or lower level petty corruption. It's right up to the very top. Bo Xilai, the railway minister, right? And Bo Xilai almost made it into the Standing Committee, right? One of our own Smith EMBA alums, he is the head of strategy for one of the big central SASAC companies. I was having breakfast with him in Beijing some time back, about a year back, and he said he knows from the grapevine in Beijing that a member of the Politburo, a member of the Central Committee who wanted to be elected to the Politburo was offering $40 million equivalent. And it was kind of common news, if you will, among the right circles in Beijing. So when you have corruption that, from top to bottom, I don't know how you fix it. Right? And I think that's going to be a serious problem, because the urban middle class, right, which has far greater ability to organize than the rural, because the urban is connected and educated, as you were saying. 90% of the people in Shanghai, the urban middle class, they suffer from the corruption. They are not the beneficiaries of corruption, right? And so when 90% of Shanghainese and Beijing people, if they are witnessing the corruption, they're educated, connected, and they're not benefiting from the corruption, they're going to demand political reform. So I think there's going to be serious political reform in the next 10 years. The nature of that still, but I don't think that the current approach continues, cannot continue.